Early on the morning of August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast of the United States. When the storm made landfall, it brought sustained winds of 100 to 140 miles an hour and stretched some 400 miles across. While the storm itself did a great deal of damage, its aftermath was catastrophic. Levee breaches led to massive flooding, and many people charged that the federal government was slow to meet the needs of the people affected by the storm. Hundreds of thousands of people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were displaced from their homes, and experts estimate that Katrina caused more than $100 billion in damage. In all, Hurricane Katrina killed nearly 2,000 people and affected some 90,000 square miles of the United States. Hundreds of thousands of evacuees scattered far and wide. The storm ultimately displaced more than 1 million people in the Gulf Coast region. 14 years later, the rebuilding of New Orleans is still a work in progress. Although communities are trying to get back on their feet and return to pre-hurricane conditions, some of the disaster's impacts will likely never be fully erased from the city. In the lower Ninth Ward, empty plots still break up the community. Houses that used to stand right next to one another are now spaced haphazardly away from each other, separated by empty land overgrown with weeds and brush. Trash piles on the corners of the streets and signs warning against loitering further accentuate the impression that things haven't improved. Businesses are staying away as well. A single grocery store, Burnell's Lower Ninth Ward Market, holds the sole responsibility of providing a small range of packaged food and fresh produce to the 1,200 people who live in the community. About 1/3 of the residents of the Lower Ninth Ward live on incomes below the poverty level. 95% of those living in the neighborhood are of African American or other non-white ethnicity. As is so often the case, poor people and people of color were disproportionately devastated by Katrina. With $51 billion in aid up for grabs, various contractors, advisors, and general con men swung into action to sweep up as much money as possible before it landed on the people affected by the storm. The aid that finally filtered down to residents of the area was held up by the very rules meant to provide relief. Hurricane Maria disproportionately affected Puerto Rico's poorest residents, who have fewer resources on hand to help them recover and rebuild. Many of these people live in more rural communities and hard to reach areas of the mountains, the last to regain access to water and see their electricity restored. Though rates of opioid use at the national scale are higher for whites than they are for Blacks, the rate of opioid overdose deaths among Blacks exceeds that of whites in several states. The lack of discussion of Black overdose deaths in the national opioid discourse marginalizes Black people and is highly consistent with a history of framing the addictions of people of color as deserving of criminal punishment rather than worthy of medical treatment. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, climate change poses threats and dangers to the survival of indigenous communities worldwide, even though indigenous peoples contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions. When community worldviews are deeply tied to the environment, what happens when that environment starts to deteriorate rapidly? Or when ancestral homelands that communities have lived in for thousands of years start to disappear? A few of the direct consequences of changing environmental conditions includes loss of natural resources, restricted access to traditional gathering areas for food and medicine, and forced displacement or relocation. Black and Latino people in the United States disproportionately live in areas that tend to be hit by natural disasters such as floods. A new study shows they are not just geographically disadvantaged in the face of climate disasters, but also economically disadvantaged. According to a study by Rice University and the University of Pittsburgh, in countries with at least $10 billion in damage, white communities gained an average of $126,000 in wealth following the damage and recovery efforts. Yet for Blacks, Latinos, and Asians living in countries hard hit by natural disasters, these communities saw their wealth decrease by an amount of $10,000 to $29,000. Incredibly, areas that receive more financial assistance from FEMA have a greater increase in wealth equality. While the effects of natural and human-made disasters often fall disproportionately on those who live on the margins, returning and rebuilding after a disaster are formidable challenges for almost everyone. Certainly this was true for the Jews returning from Babylonian captivity after some 50 to 70 years. The final chapters of Isaiah are addressed to a community returning from exile to rebuild their community. David Maxwell points out, disaster recovery is a messy business. As we have seen in the United States and other countries devastated by war, natural disasters, and forced migration. Who makes decisions? How are land grabbers and those who profit from disaster recovery controlled? Who can you trust when a ruptured social network is not yet repaired? The exiled Jews returning to Palestine must have found it hard to recognize the homeland they were forced from. Indeed, many of them had been born in exile, and this was their first glimpse of the land their parents called home. The social disconnect between the elites who had been forced to leave because of their wealth and power, and the ordinary folks who were allowed to stay grew even wider. New people, foreign people, had moved into the area while the exiles were in Babylonia. Who belongs and who does not? How can they find new ways to live in this new situation? God's response? Do what is right, work for justice. God's plan for justice is not isolationist or retaliatory. God has always exhorted the people to offer support and resources to the stranger, the foreigner. But now the returning exiles are instructed to go beyond caring for strangers and enter into covenantal relationship with the foreigners who now share their traditional homeland. The requirement that those who are accepted into the covenant must cling to that covenant, worship God, and keep the Sabbath isn't about church attendance and memorizing laws, but a way of life that honors and protects every single creature created by God, living the culture of God into reality. The invitation is widened so that the house of God becomes a house of prayer for all peoples, as God promises to gather others besides those already gathered. Living through this latest disaster, a worldwide pandemic, most of us have been able to shelter at home. We have not been evacuated or forced to move to a far-off land, but we face exile of another sort. Exile from workplaces, churches, public gathering places. Many of us have been displaced from our jobs, our routines, our comforts, and our loved ones. Predictably, poor people and people of color are the ones most seriously affected. Latino and African American residents of the United States have been 3 times as likely to be infected with the coronavirus as their white neighbors. While Black and Latino people comprise 30% of the US population. According to CDC data, Blacks and Latinos account for 39% of the COVID-19 deaths in the United States. When will we finally return from exile? We can't predict how long it will take for a safe vaccine to be developed, or for social distancing and masking to be practiced widely enough to have a significant, sustained impact. One thing we do know is that much will have changed. Our economy, our culture, and our daily lives may never be the same. This begs the question, how should we return from exile? Are we ready to execute a recovery that lifts the last and the least, that emphasizes cooperation in rebuilding over competing for aid and funding, and ensures that the lives of people of color really do matter? To do right and work for justice. That is the true return of the exiles. Amen.